I was getting married in 3 days. Mom said she'd invited someone special from home. That someone was Jason, the man who once broke me. My hands shook when I saw his name on the list. 10 years ago, he denied me in front of the whole church. Now he was walking into my rehearsal dinner smiling. Then my father, who hadn't spoken to me in years, called. He said, "I'm coming to the wedding, and I know everything. My name is Daniel Hale, and I grew up in Millbrook Hollow, a small Ohio town where everyone knew your business before you did, especially the church. My father was a deacon. My mother sang in the choir. And my older brother Mark was the golden son who never gave anyone a reason to talk. In Millbrook Hollow, Sunday service wasn't optional, and neither was fitting in. Boys played football, dated girls, and never asked questions about who they really were. My father believed a man's worth was measured by his handshake, his faith, and the family name he carried forward without shame or scandal attached to it. I learned early to watch my voice, my walk, my eyes, anything that might give away the truth I was already carrying quietly inside my chest. My grandmother Ruth lived 2 houses down, and she was the only person who never asked me to be anyone other than exactly who I was. She used to say the Hollow had a long memory and a short mercy, and I never understood how true that was until I was 17. That was the year I met Jason Cole, whose family had just moved into the old Preston place at the edge of town near the creek. Jason had an easy laugh and a way of looking at me that made the whole suffocating town feel smaller, like it couldn't reach us there. We were careful, study sessions that ran too late, fishing trips that needed no fish, secrets folded so small nobody could find the edges of them. My brother Mark started watching me differently that year. Quieter, like he was keeping something behind his teeth he didn't know how to say. My mother once caught me staring too long at Jason across the church parking lot, and she just said my name softly, like a warning. My father talked constantly about legacy, the Hale name, the family land, the inheritance he planned to leave to whichever son honored it best. I told myself I could keep both lives forever, the one they wanted and the one that was actually mine, if I was careful enough. It happened at the spring social, in the church basement, when Jason squeezed my hand under the folding table and didn't let go fast enough. Mrs. Her eyes going wide over her paper cup, and I watched the whisper travel table to table like wildfire through dry grass. By the time we got home, my father was already standing on the porch, arms crossed, and I knew somehow the whisper had beaten us there. "Is it true?" he asked, not even raising his voice, which was somehow worse than shouting, "What people are saying about you and that Cole boy." I could have lied, without saying a single word, but something in me was too tired to keep lying that night. "Yes," I said, and the porch light buzzed overhead, and my mother's hand went to her mouth, and my father didn't move for a long moment. "Not in my house," he finally said, "not with my name attached to it," and he walked inside and locked the door before I could follow him. Mark stood in the doorway, saying nothing, his face unreadable, while I sat on the cold porch steps trying to understand what had just ended. Grandmother Ruth found me there an hour later and sat down beside me without a word. Just handed me her sweater and let me shake. The next morning, my father called Pastor Nolan, and by Sunday the whole congregation somehow knew, though nobody would say it directly to my face. Jason wouldn't answer my calls. His family had heard, too, and I later learned his father had already started making plans of his own that week. Sunday service was unbearable, the whole room's eyes sliding toward our pew. Pastor Nolan's sermon suddenly about temptation, with a pointedness that felt aimed at me. My father sat rigid beside me, staring straight ahead, and my mother squeezed my hand once under the hymnal, so quick I almost missed it. After service, 3 elders pulled my father aside, and I watched his shoulders sink lower with every word they said. Like a man being sentenced, that night he told me I would see Pastor Nolan for counseling every week until this thing was corrected, and I wasn't allowed to argue. I went because refusing felt like a war I couldn't win yet, and I sat through hours of scripture aimed at convincing me I was broken. Jason stopped coming to school for 3 days, and when he returned, he wouldn't look at me in the hallway, not even once, not even briefly. I finally cornered him by the gym doors, desperate, asking what happened, and he just said, "My dad handled it," in a voice that scared me. 2 weeks later, at a town meeting about the new community center, Jason stood up in front of everyone and said we were never anything. He called it a rumor that got out of hand, said he barely knew me, and the relief on my father's face was worse than any slap. I didn't understand yet why Jason would lie that big, that publicly, in front of the entire town that had raised us both from birth. At home, my father treated Jason's denial like vindication, telling relatives the boy came to his senses, rewriting the story into something he could live with. My mother started leaving devotional pamphlets on my pillow, gentle in tone, but relentless, like water wearing down a stone 1 drop at a time. Mark finally spoke to me alone, in the barn, saying only, "Just get through this year, Danny. Just survive it." I asked him whose side he was on, and he looked away and said, "There aren't sides. There's just Dad. And Dad doesn't change his mind." Grandmother Ruth started inviting me over for pie every Thursday. No questions asked. Just company and quiet, and a woman who never once flinched at me. One Thursday she told me she'd once had a brother, my great-uncle Dell, who left the Hollow at 19 and never came back. Not even for funerals. "Nobody talks about Dell," she said, which tells you everything about how this family handles the things it doesn't understand. I filed that away carefully. My father found out about the Thursday visits and told his mother to stop filling my head with nonsense. The first time I'd seen him raise his voice at her. She told him, calm as anything, that she'd raised 4 children and buried a husband, and she wasn't about to start taking lectures from her own son. Senior year became a countdown I marked in silence. Every remaining month, another wall between me and whatever life waited past the Millbrook town line. Jason transferred to a different school across the county that spring, and I heard through the grapevine his family was selling the Preston place entirely. I never got a real goodbye. Just an empty house at the edge of town and a hole in my chest shaped exactly like him. Graduation came, and my father gave a toast about the Hale name moving forward with pride, and I drank my punch and said nothing at all. I got into a state college 3 hours away, and my father paid the first semester grudgingly, calling it an investment in getting your head straight. The night before I left, my mother packed a box of casseroles and said, "Come home for holidays, Daniel. This is still your family," like that settled it. Mark drove me to the bus station instead of letting Dad do it, and halfway there he said, "I should have said more back then. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do with that apology yet." So I just nodded and stared out the window until the hollow disappeared behind us. College felt like breathing after years underwater. And for the first time, nobody whispered when I walked into a room or held someone's hand too long. I called home every Sunday out of habit and duty, and every Sunday my father asked about my grades and never once asked about my life. Grandmother Ruth wrote me actual letters, in looping handwriting, always ending with the same line. "The hollow is smaller than you think it is, Danny." 2 years in, I stopped going home for Christmas, telling myself it was about work shifts, though we both knew it was really about the silence. My mother started calling more careful conversations that circled around the real subject, like water around a drain, never quite going down it. I built a life of small victories that year, a job I liked, an apartment I could afford, and a quiet return of the person I used to be. I told myself Jason was a closed chapter, a scar healed over, and mostly I believed it, except on certain nights when I didn't. By 23, I hadn't set foot in Millbrook Hollow in over a year, and my father hadn't asked me to, which felt like its own kind of answer. I moved to the city for a marketing job, and slowly, without meaning to, I built something that felt dangerously close to a real whole life. I found a group of friends at a community potluck, people who had their own versions of the hollow they'd left behind, their own quiet scars. We called ourselves the Sunday Table, half joking, because we gathered every week for dinner the way families are supposed to do, but sometimes don't. It was at one of those dinners that my friend Priya brought her coworker Eli Marquez, who brought homemade tamales and an easy, unhurried kind of warmth. Eli asked good questions and listened to the answers, which felt so foreign to me that I almost didn't know how to respond at first. He told me later he liked that I laughed like I meant it, not the careful, measured laugh I'd perfected for years back home in the hollow. We dated slowly, on purpose, both of us cautious with our own histories, both of us learning what safety felt like when nobody was watching. Eli had his own family complications, a father who'd come around eventually, and a mother who never fully did. So he understood the shape of my silence. 3 years in, he asked me to move in, and I said yes before he even finished the sentence, surprising both of us with how easy it felt. My mother started sending birthday cards again around that time. Small and careful. Signed only love. Mom, never once mentioning Eli by name. I told myself that was progress, even if it was slow. Even if some nights I still missed the family I used to think I had. The call that changed things came on a Tuesday. My mother, voice trembling, saying Grandmother Ruth had suffered a stroke and was asking specifically for me. I drove 6 hours through the night. Eli beside me the whole way, and walked into a hospital room where my father was already sitting. He didn't say much, just nodded at me once. And for the first time in years we sat in the same room without anyone raising their voice. Grandmother Ruth squeezed my hand from the hospital bed and whispered, "Bring that young man of yours in here. I want to see his face." Eli came in nervous, and she studied him for a long moment before saying, "Good. He looks at you the way your grandfather looked at me." My father overheard that from the hallway and said nothing. But I saw something shift behind his eyes. Something I couldn't name yet. Ruth recovered slowly over the following weeks. And during my visits, she started talking more openly about things the family had buried for decades. She told me that after I left for college, she'd been the one quietly sending me grocery money through an anonymous account. Never once mentioning it before. "I wasn't going to let you go hungry over your father's pride," she said. "So don't thank me. Just live well." She also told me, finally, the truth about her brother Dell, that he'd been sent away not for scandal, but because he loved a man in 1962. "Your father was 6 years old when it happened," she said. "He watched his own father erase a brother. That fear got planted early and deep. It didn't excuse what my father did. But for the first time I understood it wasn't only about me, it was a wound passed down whole." Around that same time, Mark called me out of nowhere and asked to meet for coffee. Just the two of us. No family occasion required. He confessed that for years he'd been quietly intercepting letters, some of Grandmother Ruth's early notes to me that our father had tried to intercept and burn. "I couldn't undo what happened," Mark said. but I could make sure you weren't completely cut off. I should have told you a long time ago. I felt something crack open in my chest, learning that even in the coldest years, someone had been fighting quietly on my side without my knowledge. Eli and I got engaged that winter, at the same overlook where we'd had our first real conversation. And I called my mother before anyone else. She cried on the phone, actual tears I could hear through the receiver, and said, "I want to help plan it. Please let me help plan it." I was cautious, but I said yes. And slowly my mother inserted herself into wedding logistics with the same careful energy she once used to avoid me. My father said little about the engagement directly, but Mark told me he'd overheard him telling a church friend, "It's Daniel's life." I'm learning that. Learning felt like a strange word to hang hope on, but it was more than I'd had in over a decade. So I let myself hold it. My mother asked, gently, if she could invite a few people from the Hollow, just to show them how far we've all come, she said. I agreed, distracted, focused on venues and flowers and Eli's excitement, not thinking to ask exactly which names from home she meant to include. Grandmother Ruth, meanwhile, quietly updated her will that spring, though nobody in the family knew the details yet, only that she'd been to see her lawyer. My father asked her about it once, and she told him only, "Everyone will get what they need, David, though maybe not what they expect." That comment unsettled him more than he let on. And Mark mentioned he'd seen our father pacing the porch the night after that conversation. The wedding date approached fast. 6 months, then 3. Then the invitations were printed and addressed in my mother's careful, looping cursive handwriting. One afternoon, Eli was helping stuff envelopes and paused over one name, asking casually, "Who's Jason Cole?" "Your mom has him on the guest list." My stomach dropped so fast I had to sit down, the name landing like a stone thrown from a decade away, still sharp at the edges. I called my mother immediately, voice shaking, asking why on earth she would invite the one person who had publicly humiliated me in front of everyone. She sounded genuinely confused, saying, "Jason? He came back to town last year to help with his mother's estate." I didn't know there was history there. I realized, stunned, that she truly didn't know, that in her mind Jason was just a nice young man from the choir who'd moved home. "He's the one." "Mom," I said, my voice cracking. "He's the one who stood up in that meeting and said we were never anything at all." There was a long silence on the line, and then she said, quietly, "Oh, Daniel, I am so sorry. I'll uninvite him tonight." Something in me hesitated, though, some old unfinished thread pulling tight, and I told her, "No, don't uninvite him." Eli wasn't thrilled about the idea, but supported it, saying only, "If you need closure at our wedding, I trust you to know what closure looks like." Grandmother Ruth, when I told her, said something strange. There's always more to a story than the version that gets repeated at church suppers. "Danny." I asked her what she meant, and she just smiled and said, "You'll find out. Just don't decide how you feel about him until you actually talk." I didn't understand it then, but I trusted her enough to hold my judgment loosely, even as anger simmered under my calm every time I thought of him. My father called 2 weeks before the wedding, the first time he'd called me directly in nearly 11 years, and I almost didn't answer the phone. "I heard about the invitation situation," he said stiffly. "Your mother told me. Daniel, if you'll have me." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, unable to speak, because I had stopped expecting that sentence from him years ago. I told my father he could come, though my voice shook saying it, and he said, I know I have a lot to make up for. I know. After I hung up, Eli found me sitting on the kitchen floor, and I just said, I don't know if I can survive both of them in one room. The rehearsal dinner arrived faster than I was ready for. Held at a rented barn outside the city. String lights strung between old wooden beams. Jason walked in halfway through dinner. Older. Quieter. Standing awkwardly near the door until my mother, mortified, ushered him toward an empty seat near the back. Our eyes met across the room, and for a second I was 17 again, standing on that porch listening to a lock click shut behind me. He approached me near the drink table, hands shoved in his pockets, and said, I know I'm the last person you want here. I almost didn't come. Then why did you? I asked, sharper than I meant to, and he flinched like the words had physical weight, like he'd been braced for them. Because I've owed you an explanation for 10 years, he said. And I was a coward every single day. I didn't give it to you. I told him I didn't need his explanation, that I'd build a life without it. But some part of me stayed rooted to that spot, listening anyway. He told me his father had found out about us before mine did, and had threatened to call in a business loan against my father's small hardware store. He said your family would lose everything, Jason said. The store, the house, all of it, unless I made it disappear publicly, completely, immediately. I stood frozen, recalculating everything I thought I knew, because I had spent a decade believing Jason simply hadn't loved me enough to stay. I was 17, he said, and I thought I was protecting your family. I didn't know how to protect you and them at the same time. Grandmother Ruth appeared beside us then, seemingly out of nowhere, and said quietly, your father knew about that loan threat. Daniel. He never told you either. I turned to her, stunned, and she explained that my father had quietly paid off that very loan 2 years later. In full. Never once mentioning why. He was too proud and too scared to explain it, she said. So he just let you believe the worst about a boy who was only trying to survive. My anger didn't fully dissolve, but it cracked open into something more complicated. Grief for 2 teenagers crushed under adults who valued reputation over honesty. Jason apologized again. Plainly this time, no excuses layered on top, and said he hoped I could forgive him even if we could never be what we were. I told him I needed time, that a decade of hurt didn't dissolve over rehearsal dinner chicken. And he nodded, said he understood, and stepped back. Later that night, my father called again, his voice strange and tight, saying he'd had chest pains and was heading to the emergency room with my mother. Panic swallowed the rest of the evening. Eli drove me to the hospital while I called Mark, who was already 3 states away and racing back. Doctors said it was a mild cardiac episode, stress-related, and that my father would need rest but would very likely be fine within a few weeks. Sitting in that waiting room, my mother finally told me the whole story of Uncle Del, the one Ruth had only hinted at before that night. Your father has spent his whole life terrified of becoming his own father, she said, and terrified of losing you the way that family lost Delaware. I sat with that, the fear finally making a strange, sad kind of sense, without excusing a single year of silence I'd endured because of it. My father, still pale in the hospital bed, grabbed my sleeve and said, I don't want to die having only pushed you away. Daniel, I want to fix this. I told him the wedding was still happening in 2 days, whether or not he was strong enough. And he said, I will be there if it kills me. Grandmother Ruth, sitting nearby, muttered that it had better not literally kill him. And for a strange moment the whole family actually laughed together. The next day brought a new complication. Jason called to say he understood if the family needed space and offered to skip the wedding entirely. I sat with that offer for an hour, talked it through with Eli, and finally called Jason back and told him he could come if he wanted closure too. Eli, generous in a way I didn't fully deserve that week, said only, let the whole messy family in the room. Let's just get married anyway. My mother spent the morning before the wedding apologizing over and over for the invitation mix-up, until I finally told her it had led somewhere necessary. Mark arrived that afternoon and pulled me aside, saying our father had asked him to help write something, though he wouldn't say exactly what yet. Grandmother Ruth handed me a sealed envelope that morning, saying only, open this after the vows, not before. Trust an old woman on this one. I tucked the envelope into my jacket pocket, my hands unsteady, unsure whether I was more nervous about the wedding or everything circling around it. The morning of the wedding was bright and clear, the kind of Ohio transplanted to city sky that felt almost too generous given everything happening underneath it. My mother helped me with my tie, hands still shaking slightly from the hospital scare 2 nights before, and said, he's coming. He promised he's coming. I kept glancing toward the venue entrance during photos, half expecting my father not to show, half afraid of exactly what it would mean if he did. Eli found me pacing behind the arbor and took both my hands, saying, whatever happens today, in an hour you and I will already be married. That steadied me more than anything else could have. The simple, unglamorous truth that the actual point of the day was still ours, regardless of the noise. Mark came to find me with a small folded paper, saying our father had asked him to read something during the reception if he couldn't manage it himself. I asked what it said, and Mark just shook his head, smiling faintly, and said, it's not mine to spoil. Just trust him today. Danny. Please. Grandmother Ruth arrived in her wheelchair, dressed sharper than anyone else at the wedding, insisting loudly that she did not survive a stroke to miss this. Jason arrived early, hovering near the back rows, and gave me a small, careful nod that I returned without quite knowing what I felt yet. My mother kept checking her phone every few minutes, and I finally asked her directly if my father was actually going to make it in time. He left the house an hour ago, she said. Traffic is bad. Daniel. I promise you, he is trying harder than he's ever tried. The ceremony space filled slowly, old college friends, the Sunday table crowd, a scattering of relatives from the hollow, all gathering under one tent. I stood at the arbor with Eli, both of us steadying each other, and the officiant asked quietly if we were ready to begin without further delay. Just as the music started, a car door slammed somewhere behind the seating rows, and I heard my mother's sharp, relieved intake of breath beside me. I turned, and there was my father, moving slower than usual, gray around the edges but upright, walking toward an open seat near the very front. He caught my eye once, gave a small nod, the same gesture Mark had given me the night he drove me to the bus station years ago. Something loosened in my chest that I hadn't realized was still clenched. A decade of bracing finally allowed, for one moment, to rest. The ceremony began. Vows exchanged simply and honestly. Eli's voice steady, mine less so. Both of us laughing through the parts we'd rehearsed and forgotten. We were pronounced married to applause and a few audible sniffles. And I caught Grandmother Ruth dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief she'd saved for decades. As we walked back down the aisle, I saw my father standing, clapping slowly, tears openly running down a face I had rarely seen unguarded. The reception moved into the barn, string lights glowing, and I slipped away for one private minute to finally open Grandmother Ruth's sealed envelope. Inside was a short letter in her looping handwriting, explaining that she had rewritten her will months earlier to leave the old hollow house directly to me. Not because I love you more, she wrote, but because you were the one who needed proof, in writing, that this family's roots were still yours too. She also wrote a line about Dell, saying she'd found an old photo of him and a man named Walter, and she wanted me to have it. Tucked in the envelope was the faded photograph. Two young men laughing on a porch in 1961. An entire hidden history captured in one small square. I stood there holding proof that this family had buried love before. More than once, and I was the first one given the truth outright. I wiped my eyes and rejoined the reception just as the DJ tapped the microphone, announcing that the groom's brother had a toast to give. Mark stood, paper trembling slightly in his hand, and began reading words that were clearly not entirely his own, his voice catching on certain lines. Our father asked me to read this, Mark said, because he wasn't sure his own voice would make it through without breaking somewhere in the middle. The letter began with an apology, plain and unadorned. I spent years protecting a name instead of protecting my son, and I was wrong every single day. It continued, revealing that my father had known about the lone threat from Jason's father the entire time, and had quietly paid it off in secret. I let Daniel believe a good man abandoned him. The letter said, because admitting the truth meant admitting my own cowardice in the face of my own father's ghost. Gasps moved through the crowd as the letter named Dell directly. The family's long-buried secret spoken aloud for the first time at a public gathering. I watched my father erase my brother from every photograph in this family. The letter continued. And I promised myself I'd never let history repeat. Then I let it repeat anyway. The barn had gone completely silent except for Mark's voice. Steady now, carrying our father's words to every corner of the room without flinching. Jason, near the back, had gone pale, clearly not expecting his own history to surface this publicly, glancing toward the exit like he wanted to disappear. Eli reached for my hand under the table, grounding me. As the letter moved toward its final lines, the whole room holding one collective breath. To Jason Cole, if you are here today, the letter read, I owe you an apology too. You were a boy protecting his own family, and I judged you as a man. Jason's shoulders dropped, some old weight visibly leaving him, and a few nearby guests turned to look at him with something closer to sympathy than judgment. To my son Daniel, the letter continued, I am late, later than any father should be, but I am here now, and I am not leaving again. Mark folded the paper, and for a moment nobody moved, until my mother stood and walked to my father's table, taking his hand in front of everyone. I stood up without fully deciding to walk toward my father's seat, and he rose to meet me halfway, both of us unsteady on our feet. I should have said this a decade ago, he said, voice breaking completely now, but I am proud of who you are. Daniel, I am proud. I hadn't heard those words from him in my entire adult life, and hearing them now cracked something open that 10 years of anger hadn't managed to. We hugged, clumsy and tight, the whole barn erupting into applause and a few loud, unashamed sobs from at least 3 different tables at once. Grandmother Ruth called out, well, it only took a heart attack and a wedding, but here we are, and the room broke into relieved, watery laughter. I turned toward Jason, who was quietly trying to slip toward the exit, and called his name loud enough that the whole barn heard it. He stopped, turned back, uncertain, and I walked over and simply said, thank you for finally telling me the truth. Even 10 years too late. I'm not asking for anything, Jason said quietly. I just wanted you to know I never stopped feeling sorry for the boy I left behind that year. I told him I forgave him. Not because it erased the pain, but because carrying it forward into my marriage felt like the wrong kind of inheritance. Eli came over then, offered his hand to Jason, and said, "Thank you for being honest tonight. It gave my husband something he's needed a long time." Jason shook his hand, visibly moved, and said quietly that he hoped we'd both have the life the Hollow had once tried to convince us we couldn't. My father, still holding my mother's hand, said loudly enough for the room to hear, "There's plenty of family here tonight. I hope everyone eats well." It was such an ordinary sentence, so entirely him, that I laughed out loud through my tears, recognizing my father trying to be a father again. Mark hugged me next, saying, "I should have told you about the letters years ago. I'm done letting fear decide what this family says out loud." For the first time in over a decade, every person who mattered to me stood in one room, imperfect and healing, but finally together. My mother pulled me aside briefly and admitted she'd suspected for months that my father was planning some kind of apology, but hadn't known its shape. He's been seeing Pastor Weber, a different pastor, for months, she said, working through things he never let himself examine before your grandmother's stroke. I hadn't known that either. Another quiet thread of change happening behind the scenes while I'd been consumed with wedding planning and old wounds. Grandmother Ruth called me over to her table and told me the story behind Walter. Dell's love, in full, filling in years I'd never known existed. Dell wrote me letters for 30 years, she said, until he passed. I have every one of them in a box at the Hollow House. They're yours now, too. I realized the house she'd left me wasn't just wood and land. It was an archive of the family's hidden history, waiting for someone brave enough to hold it. Jason found me once more before leaving, and told me he was moving back to the Hollow to help care for his aging mother full-time. "Maybe I'll actually be honest there this time," he said, half joking, half not. And I told him the Hollow could use a little more honesty overall. My father, sitting now with a small plate of food he clearly wasn't finishing, asked if he could visit the city sometime, properly, not in an emergency. I told him yes, and meant it, surprising myself with how easily the invitation came after years of assuming I'd never offer him one again. Eli's own parents, seated nearby, watched the whole unfolding drama with quiet understanding, having navigated their own long road toward accepting their son fully. Eli's mother told my mother privately that it took her almost 7 years to say husband instead of friend, and she regretted every one of those years. My mother nodded slowly, absorbing that, and said she didn't intend to waste any more years than she already had on careful, hedging language. The band started playing again, and my father, of all people, asked my mother to dance, moving stiffly but determinedly onto the small wooden floor. Mark pulled me into an easy hug and said, "For what it's worth, I always liked Eli. I just never knew how to say any of this out loud." I told him it was never too late, gesturing at the whole absurd, healing scene around us, proof that apparently nothing in this family was ever truly too late. Grandmother Ruth raised a small glass of sparkling cider and toasted. To Dell, to Walter, to every Hale who couldn't say this out loud before tonight. The whole barn raised their glasses with her. Guests who barely knew the family history joining in anyway, moved by whatever they just witnessed unfold. I looked around at my father dancing badly, my mother laughing, Mark grinning, Ruth glowing, Eli watching me with quiet pride, and Jason slipping out gently into the night. It struck me that acceptance rarely arrives as one clean moment. It arrives messy, late, and imperfect, stitched together from apologies nobody thought they'd hear. Someone put on an old hymn as a joke, something from childhood choir practice, and half the room, including my father, started singing it anyway. I sang too, surprising myself. The words landing differently now than they had back in that church basement a decade ago. Lighter somehow, unburdened. Eli squeezed my hand and whispered, "Your family is a lot," and I laughed and told him that was, apparently, the highest compliment I could offer that night. By midnight, the barn had emptied to just close family, sitting together around one long table, sharing pie Grandmother Ruth had insisted on bringing herself. In the months that followed, my father visited the city twice, awkward but trying, and slowly learned to say "my son's husband" without hesitation. Grandmother Ruth's box of Dell and Walter's letters became the seed of a small family memoir I started writing. One neither of us expected to need. I used to think coming home meant hiding pieces of myself at the door, but I finally understood that home was wherever I could be whole. Millbrook Hollow, my mother, my father, Mark, Ruth, Eli, they all found their way, eventually, to the same simple truth: love was always worth the risk. The Yindi.